When Detective Ramos unwrapped the small gift-wrapped jar left on the precinct's doorstep, the last thing he expected to find inside was a human tongue, perfectly preserved in formaldehyde, curled like a dead slug, and a handwritten label on the glass that simply read, "Gift." Melanie Brooks had a routine so precise it bordered on ritual. Every weekday evening she would close up Briar Glen's small public library at exactly 8 p.m., set the alarm and take the same path home, past the bakery, across the quiet pedestrian bridge and down Ashwood Lane where her rented duplex sat with its yellow porch light always glowing. She was known for her punctuality, her soft-spoken nature, and her complete disinterest in drama. People in town often said Melanie could vanish into a room before you noticed she'd even been there. Maybe that was why no one noticed when she didn't arrive home that Thursday night. The library's back door was locked. The lights were off. Her car was parked exactly where it always was. But when she didn't clock in the next morning, her coworker called it in. Police arrived expecting a late-night miscommunication, maybe car trouble or a short trip out of town. But when they stepped into her home, everything was too perfect. The dishes from Wednesday night's dinner were still drying on the rack. A book was laid open on the arm of her couch, a silk bookmark resting just beneath her last read line. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. Her wallet, keys and phone were all untouched on the kitchen counter. Her bed was made. Her shoes were by the door. Detective Ramos, who had worked in bigger cities before transferring to Briar Glen for a quieter life, felt the cold unease immediately. It was the kind of silence that didn't sit right, like the scene had been too carefully left behind as though it were staged. He interviewed the neighbors but no one had seen anything. One elderly tenant recalled hearing a single noise around 10 p.m., something like a door softly clicking shut. That was it. No scream. No car engine. Just silence. When Ramos reviewed the security footage from the library's single exterior camera, the last known sighting of Melanie came into focus. At 7:59 p.m. she walked out the front door in her long beige coat, umbrella in hand. She looked over her shoulder, paused, then locked the door and walked out of frame. There was no sign of distress. But one detail caught his attention, her eyes. She blinked too often as if forcing herself not to cry. As she turned to lock the door, her lips moved slightly, mouthing something, repeating a phrase. They sent the footage to a lip reader. The translation came back, "Don't follow me." At first the phrase made no sense. Who would she be speaking to? Who was following her? There was no one else visible on camera. But what turned the investigation from strange to chilling was what they discovered in her office drawer. A hidden compartment beneath the bottom file tray. Inside were 5 letters, folded neatly, all written in the same uneven cursive. Each one was unsigned. And every single letter ended the same way, "You promised not to tell." The contents of the letters were vague but disturbing. They spoke of secrets kept in the basement, and someone still hearing the crying at night. One mentioned a girl who tried to run, but they cut her silence loose. There was no date, no return address, nothing that linked them to anyone. But what struck Ramos was Melanie's reaction. Each letter had notes scribbled on the backs, responses she'd never sent. "It's not my fault," one said. Another simply read, "I was only a child." Her notes weren't defensive, they were desperate. As though she were being hunted not just by a person but by guilt. As investigators widened the scope, they began pulling details from her past. Melanie had grown up in the state foster system, transferred from home to home. Her records were incomplete, but one entry stood out. A year spent at St. Helena's Residential Center, a place closed down over a decade ago after a series of abuse allegations that never made the headlines. Digging deeper into that time revealed something even more peculiar. Of the 10 children in her group during that year, 4 had died before the age of 30. 2 by overdose. 1 in a fire. And another went missing without a trace. Now, with Melanie vanished and a preserved human tongue in a labeled jar appearing just hours after she was last seen, things were beginning to line up in the most terrifying way. The tongue had a small tattoo on the underside, a star, almost faded. Melanie had the same star tattoo behind her ear. Her dentist confirmed from the records, it was hers. The theory now wasn't abduction. It was message. Someone wanted this discovery to be theatrical, like an announcement. They didn't want to simply take Melanie, they wanted everyone to know she was being punished. And the word gift wasn't arbitrary. It was deliberate. A dark gesture of closure. Or a warning. As Ramos pieced it all together, a portrait of a woman emerged, not just quiet and reserved, but someone who had spent her entire life running from something unspeakable. Whatever she'd experienced as a child, Whatever trauma had been buried in the silence of those years, was now clawing its way back to the surface. But Melanie didn't just disappear. She was silenced in the most literal, horrifying way possible. And whoever did it, wasn't finished yet. 3 days after Melanie's disappearance, while the investigation was already teetering on the edge of desperation, a small antique wooden puzzle box arrived at the front desk of the Briar Glen police station. It was unmarked, no return address, no postage. It had been hand-delivered, but no one had seen who dropped it off. The box was sealed shut with a complex sliding mechanism that took forensics nearly 30 minutes to open. Inside were 3 items: an origami crane stained with a reddish-brown blotch, a USB flash drive, and a folded note with 5 words written in neat black ink. "Want to hear her last words?" The message sent a ripple through the department. Everyone froze. Detective Ramos personally took the drive to be scanned and isolated on a secure machine. No malware. No virus. Just a single audio file labeled her_voice_final.wave. He hesitated before playing it. Something about the note made his stomach turn, like he was about to witness something intimate, something sacred, and twisted. The recording began with faint crackling like an old cassette. Then came a distant echo of breath, soft, irregular. There were murmurs, almost inaudible, as if someone was whispering while hiding under a blanket. The words were hard to make out, but Ramos recognized a rhythm, a pattern. The voice repeated something in a sing-song manner, a kind of chant or rhyme. And then came the sobbing. Gut-wrenching, muffled sobs, followed by silence. The final sound was a faint creak, metal on wood, maybe a door hinge, and then it stopped. Exactly 3 minutes and 13 seconds of haunting audio. Forensics cleaned up the file and tried to isolate the voice. It was indeed female. Likely Melanie. But it was the pattern of her whispers that stood out. A retired linguist was brought in to decipher the rhythmic nature of the sounds. It wasn't random. The repetition mirrored a specific cadence. 4 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause. It matched the tempo of a game known as Whisper Maze, a cruel psychological activity used in certain foster homes to train children into silence. The object of the game was simple. Whisper a phrase down a line of children, and if the message changed before reaching the last, the entire group would be punished. Melanie had mentioned this game once during therapy, buried deep in a court-ordered psychological evaluation when she was 16. She described it as the punishment game, a test of loyalty where the prize for winning was being left alone. If you failed, the punishment varied. Standing barefoot outside in the cold. No food. Isolation in the basement. The report was ignored back then, dismissed as the imagination of a traumatized child. But now, the ghost of that game had resurfaced, and it was speaking to them through the audio. Even more disturbing, the origami crane wasn't just stained, it was soaked in pig's blood, confirmed by the lab. The way it was folded also pointed to a pattern Melanie once used as a teenager in therapy art sessions. She folded cranes obsessively. Dozens. She said they gave her peace because, in her words, they listened and never repeated anything. Ramos and his team began cross-referencing the Whisper Maze with other foster children who had been housed at St. Helena's during the same time as Melanie. A few names popped up. Some were dead. A few were untraceable. One, however, had recently been institutionalized in another state. His records were sealed under a new identity. When pressed for access, the authorities pushed back, hard. It was clear something about this facility and its former residents was being kept from public view. Meanwhile, another letter arrived, this time slipped under Ramos' own door at home. No envelope. No stamp. Just a single sheet of paper that read, "Only those who played remember the rules. And those who broke them, lose their voice." The phrase echoed one of the final lines from the audio file. When played in reverse, Melanie's whispers formed the eerie repetition of, "I didn't tell. I didn't tell. I didn't," until it faded out entirely. It was no longer just about finding Melanie. It was about decoding a past that had been deliberately erased. A system built to silence children had bred someone who now used that silence as a weapon. Someone was turning a childhood trauma into a blueprint for psychological revenge. And with every move, they weren't just taunting investigators, they were dragging them deeper into a puzzle Melanie had spent her life trying to escape from. The gift box, the whisper game, the blood-stained crane, all of it was ritualistic. Calculated. The sender wasn't just interested in torture or cruelty. They were creating a narrative. A retribution story where Melanie wasn't the first character, and likely wouldn't be the last. The pieces weren't random, they were chapters. Each clue a line in a story no one wanted to read. And it was only just beginning. The name, St. Helena's Residential Center, had become a ghost in the investigation, a place that lived only in forgotten files and whispered warnings from people who no longer wanted to talk. But then a new voice entered the picture, a retired psychiatric nurse named Evelyn Carr. She had worked at St. Helena's during the same year Melanie had been admitted. After seeing the case unfold on the local news, she contacted the department, claiming to remember something. Someone that no one else had ever mentioned in the records. Evelyn recalled a boy, never officially registered under any of the standard intake names, who had arrived late in the year. He was unusually quiet, never spoke a word, and refused to make eye contact. The other children called him the Echo, not because of anything he said, but because he always appeared behind them, silently, suddenly, as though repeating their movements without sound. Evelyn remembered catching him once, kneeling outside a therapy room door, holding an old tape recorder. When she asked what he was doing, he didn't answer. He simply looked up and pressed play. What came through the tiny speaker was the sound of another child crying. Just crying. Loud and long and raw. There were rumors that the boy had been part of an experimental behavior suppression program at another facility before being transferred unofficially to St. Helena's. Nothing was written in the books. His room didn't exist on the roster. But the children knew him. Some were terrified of him. Others simply avoided saying his name at all. One child, according to Evelyn's notes, once said during a therapy session, "If you tell, he takes your voice. And he saves it forever." When Ramos and his team dug into the closed files of the facility's last years, they found inconsistencies. Rooms with logs but no listed residents. Medical charts with no patient IDs. And then, in the darkest corner of the archive, they found a box, unlabeled, containing cassette tapes. Most were blank. But a few had recordings. Children talking to therapists. Children playing. And some were recordings of children crying, whispering, and begging. Their names were never stated. But one of the tapes was unmistakable. Melanie's voice. Much younger. Whispering, "Please don't make me go back. He hears everything. Even when you dream." The horror of what that implied hit the team hard. Whoever the Echo was, he wasn't just a childhood ghost. He was real. And he had been recording their pain, hoarding it like trophies. The working theory was that he had aged into obscurity, moving through the system until he vanished, off the books, off the radar. But he had resurfaced. And now he wasn't just collecting sounds. He was orchestrating something much worse. With Melanie gone and her tongue delivered in a jar, Ramos now believed the Echo hadn't simply targeted her out of revenge. This was personal. A continuation of something that started decades ago. A game she once lost and thought she'd escaped. But no one escapes someone like him, not if he remembers your voice. When Ramos returned to the evidence room to re-examine the original jar labeled gift, he noticed something odd. The ink used on the label wasn't standard marker. It was archival ink, used in museums and libraries to label long-term collections. It was the kind of thing Melanie would have used in the preservation section of the Briar Glen Library. The jar hadn't just been a trophy. It had been curated. Preserved, named, presented. They began tracing purchases of archival supplies. And one transaction stood out. 6 weeks prior, a man had ordered a set of specialized archival pens, formaldehyde-grade jars, and voice recorders from an online supplier using a fake name, Samuel Mears. But the address given led to an abandoned farmhouse just outside town, one that used to be part of a therapeutic retreat center decades ago, before St. Helena's shut down. The house was empty, but the basement was not. Downstairs the air was cold and heavy. Dust floated in long shafts of light through broken windows. On the walls were old photos, all black and white, of children's mouths cropped just beneath the nose. Their eyes were cut out of the prints. Each photo was tagged with a date, a number. And in the corner of the room sat an old wooden file cabinet. Inside were folders, each one labeled not with names but with sounds. Sobbing, female, age 7. Scream, male, age 9. Whisper, unknown, midnight session. Each folder contained cassette tapes. Hundreds of them. Melanie's folder wasn't there. But one had a blank label. Inside it was a recent tape. When they played it, Ramos recognized the voice immediately. It was Melanie's, recorded not as a child, but just days before she disappeared. Her voice was weak, trembling, whispering again and again, "It's not my fault. I didn't tell. Please, not again." The Echo had her. He had her right there, and he had made her speak before taking her silence forever. Ramos stood in that basement, surrounded by the soundless history of children who had vanished into the cracks of a broken system. He realized something chilling then. The Echo didn't want to kill Melanie. He wanted to collect her final sound. Her last whisper. Her last fear. That was the gift. The tongue was just the symbol. And somewhere he was still out there, listening. Waiting for the next voice to break.